Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all here today. Where's Linda today? Yeah.
She's not doing well.
Oh, okay. Good to see. I thought she was distant us or something. Yeah. Oh, okay. Good to see you all today. This is Old Times Day. Cynthia is with us today, and Cynthia was here shortly after I came. I came in 77. That was just 3 years, 4 years, get my math right. And her family was here for a long time and have a lot of history together. Pray for her sister. She's not doing well. Well, let's open in prayer. God, I thank you that we have this time to be together and to study the scriptures and to learn together and to properly handle the Word of God and not use it as a collection of proof texts to prove what we want to believe and think, especially about the issues that we're covering right now with slavery. May we see the benefit of being slaves of Christ, of yielding ourselves completely over to Him to control our minds and wills and lives, to be sold out to Him completely. And I pray, Lord, that you will bless us in our class today. Give us understanding through Christ our Savior. Amen. So we are in, and let's go to it to start. Go back to 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going through 1 Peter in Sunday school, and we stopped here to take a little hiatus in chapter 2 on doing what's called a biblical theological study. Fancy term, isn't it? You can tell people that in Sunday school, what are you doing? Well, we're doing a biblical theological study. What's that mean? I don't know. It means we're going to look at this idea of this term of slavery as it's used in the New Testament. We did the Old Testament too, but we're going to stick today to the New Testament, of how it's used and how do we see it in its context and what does it mean. Now, having had the time ahead of time that we've already been a couple weeks on this lesson and talked about the different kinds of slavery and what they mean and all, and that the Greco-Roman slavery was not anywhere near what slavery was in Saudi Arabia and in Iran and places like that, and parts of Africa, which were horrendous, maiming people, killing people, just terrible stuff. But that the slavery that they're talking about most frequently in the Bible is dealing with people that are financially indebted to another person for some reason. In the Old Testament, you could sell yourself and to be provided for, and then on the year of Jubilee, what happened? Everything went back to the original, start over again, get a fresh start. But in the time of Jesus, many times, people that did not have money but were trying to better themselves and become doctors, become even lawyers and civil servants in charge of a town, to be plumbers. They didn't have any electricians in those days, but to be plumbers, I was hoping somebody would laugh at that. And carpenters or whatever else you might apprentice for, as well, the person that who's taking care of you would pay for your apprenticeship, your learning, your tools, and you would owe them so many years of work as a slave. It was called a slave, also the word servant, but it actually meant slave, that you would owe them, and they owned you for that period of time in respect to what you did. They didn't own your soul. They didn't own you like we had slavery in America. They owned you as far as your work and your livelihood and your responsibility to them. And then when that period of time that was agreed upon was over, then you were let free again, and you now could not have to give a portion of your money to them, but it became your own as you earned the money and things. But there were also poorer people that were slaves, and they would remain slaves for long, long periods of time, and they did such things as the common work in a house. They were housekeepers and things of that nature, some of the more menial jobs and all, servants of a family kind of a thing. And many times they were not interested in buying themselves out of slavery. They were happy doing what they did and living where they lived, because they would live better than they would on their own. But it did not come with the understanding of physical torture and hurt and punishment of that nature, though there are examples, and we'll look at some of them today and what we were told to do in that situation. But it's not like the devastation and treatment of a person that happened in the slavery we're familiar with in our country and other countries as well in the modern era. And it's important to know this, because people who were trying to support slavery in America would look at some of these passages and say, see, the Bible supports our slavery. The South, pastors in the South were notorious for preaching a biblical view of slavery that God intended, and they even came up with an idea from Genesis, and I'm not going to go through that, I did it before when we did racism, where they actually assigned the children of Ham to a forever position of slavery and chattel. You could abuse them any way you want, kind of a thing. It's terrible. But you see, the natural heart, if we have something we want to prove and we have something we want to support, nothing's better than going to the Bible and being able to support it. And that's what the natural heart tries to do. And that's why trying to teach for years, read the Bible in its context, understand it more in the immediate and remote and broader context. That's what biblical theology study is all about, getting this whole thing in context, so that you don't just give it your own slant, but you let it teach you. Now you teach it. And have you ever heard the little slogan that a text without a context is a proof text that was meant to be a pretext? I got it all mixed up. But in other words, you can't take a text, a proof text, out of its context, because then it's a pretext for whatever you want it to say. And that's what happens many times with people and their learning of the scriptures. It's one verse, and then I tell you what I want this verse to mean. People preach that way, where they take a verse and they make it say what they want it to say, and they make a whole message, and they use the verse as a springboard, like a diving board, into a pool of their own thoughts, kind of a thing. Never listen to people that do that. Be sure that they use the text in the context, immediate and remote and complete, okay? Now, let's get to it. So, the idea of slavery is that a slave in the scriptures is someone whose person and service belong wholly to another. Is there any definition about time in that definition? No. So the time can vary. But it's saying that when you're a slave in the biblical culture context, your person in service belonged wholly to another. You were at their beck and call to do the work that they have you do, and you are now responsible to that. Now turn that away from a job or work that you're to do and put that as a spiritual understanding, because the Bible uses slavery in a spiritual way as a great, great understanding. It is what it means to follow Jesus. And when you're a slave of Christ, you're someone whose person and service belongs wholly to Jesus. Now, is that a bad thing? That's a great thing. And that's why the Bible uses the term slave to Christians. We are slaves of God. We are slaves of Christ. Because the basic understanding of slavery is that your person and your service belong wholly to another. And what's the period of time for slavery if you're a carpenter? It's as you do your work and for how long you apprentice. But what's your period of time if you're a slavery to God, if you're a slave of Jesus? It's forever. It's unending. It's forever. It's all the time. So that's why it's used all the time. Because God sees that as this is going to be to your benefit. When you realize that you are you belong wholly to me. In your person and your service, you belong wholly to me. Then that's going to be your joy. That's going to be your good. That's going to be your pleasure when that happens. And it's been so hard, especially for black people in many places when they read the Bible and they hear this word slavery, because I'm sure, Angie, when you heard the word slavery in the Bible, you're thinking of slavery that we had understood in America, and those things. And how can God use that term when it was so devastating? Well, God doesn't support what we did. I told you before, all the treatment of people how bad we treated people and all. There's so much in the scriptures about don't do that. That's not right to do. That it's not the same, and it can't be the same. So don't think of it that way. We need to think of it in relationship to giving ourselves over to God. Now, having said that, so that we renew some of that, let's start with 1 Corinthians 7 today. Oh, I got you to 1 Peter 2. Let me read you the passage where it is. It's verse 18. In 1 Peter 2:18, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. And we're going to come back and look at this text in a bit, hopefully today. But I want to cover some other texts first. But this is the context that we're studying about the use of the word slave. So let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you will, with me, please, and take a little chronological, as far as the scriptures are put together, not time-wise, but through the scriptures. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And look at some of these passages. I want you to be familiar with these passages so that you're not stunned by them or tricked into believing something other than what is really being taught, so that you're familiar with these and you understand and you can be comfortable reading them and not say, well, this can't be part of the Bible, this can't be true. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 21 and following. It begins in verse 21. We're going to go down to verse 24. Okay, everybody there? Were you a slave when you were called? He's talking to people that are now believers. Were you a slave when you're called? Then don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. So what's he saying? If you're a slave when you came to Christ, stay there. But if you can gain your freedom, how are you going to gain your freedom? Run away? That would gain freedom, wouldn't it? But that's not legal. You can't run away. How do you gain freedom? Bruce, say it louder, Bruce. Pay your debt. Get out of debt. If a brother or sister in church wants to help you, but pay it all. If you're able to do that and separate from your slavery contract, then do so. It's good to do. It would be good to do. For the one who was a slave when called to faith is the Lord's freed person. So if you were a slave of another apprentice situation perhaps, and you were called to the Lord under that situation, you're still a slave in that situation, but what are you in the Lord? Free. You're free, and yet you're called to be what in the Lord? A slave. it's up the down staircase. It's a paradox. You're free in the Lord, meaning as relationship to any other people, but you're a slave of Christ because you're now his. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. That's not a bad thing. That's an honorable thing. You were bought at a price. What was the price when you're a slave of Christ that you were bought with? The blood of Jesus, the death of Jesus. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when called. So, if you were a slave when called, then you stay there, unless, of course, you can buy your freedom, then do so. But the point is, brothers, do not become slaves of human beings. So don't sell yourself into that. Don't go that direction. Well, what are you going to do instead? You've got to trust God. And let him work with you and take care of you and provide you that apprenticeship or whatever else you need to do. You need to trust him in that matter. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Just a page over or so, verses 19 through 23. Paul says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone. That's an interesting thought. What's he mean by that? What do you think he means by that?
Did he help as many people as he could?
Close. That would be some of the outcome. Think of the definition of what slavery means. That your person and your service belong completely to another. So when he says in verse 19, though I am free, I'm not a slave of anybody, I don't owe anybody money or whatever, and belong to no one. Now he's not meaning Jesus, and he's not saying that. He's talking about people on this level. To no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone. So I'm going to serve and care for who? Everybody, as if I were their personal slave. For what reason? To win as many as possible. To have an opportunity to share the gospel and to show the love of God and to win as many as possible. So to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. That's still the Jews. Though I myself am not under the law because of being in Christ now. So as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, then who's that then? The Gentiles. I became like one not having the law. Though I am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law. I'm not under the law of Moses anymore, but I'm under the law of Christ, what he has to say. So as to win those not having the law, which is the Gentiles. So to the weak I became weak, to win the weak. And I become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that they may share in its blessings. So he says, I'm going to voluntarily make myself a slave to everybody, though I'm not bound by anybody other than Jesus, but I'm going to make myself a slave to everybody, as if I'm going to treat you as if I'm your servant. That's how I'm going to treat you, Paul said, to win as many as possible. Okay, you following this? So it's not a bad connotation, is it? You're understanding in its context. All right, look at Ephesians 6. If you notice, we just keep making right-hand turns. Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 9. The reason that slaves are addressed so much in the epistles is because so much of the economy of the biblical world at the time involved slavery in the economy. Again, for apprenticeships, for employment, for learning, as well as service in homes and things like that. I read in my study that at the time of Jesus, in the city of Rome, fully 1/3 of all the Roman citizens were slaves, had put themselves in a situation where they were in service to someone else. Fully 1/3. Ephesians 6, beginning in verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. Now, how much do you think the slave owners in the South loved this verse in the Bible? They loved it. No one else, the slave owners loved it. Because they wanted what? They wanted to be obeyed and be treated with respect as the masters. And their whole concept of masters was different as well, which is another study for another time. And with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. So that really should have taken the sting out of what they were trying to say. Because if you're to obey me just as you would obey Christ, would Christ ever ask you to do something that's going to destroy you, hurt you, diminish you? Is he going to take your children away from you? You know, all these things that were done, the Bible does not support, and Jesus does not support. And that's the thing that they missed. They didn't take it to the next step to understand that. Yeah, but there's other scriptures that apply to this as well and define this. Doris, you look puzzled. Okay, it was just a look today. Okay, to define this. And we need to let God define these things, and you can't be a slave of Jesus and then treat somebody in the same way that you are treated by Jesus and are responsible to Jesus, and then expect to receive the junk and all the problems that they got. You with me?
Yeah, Pastor, I think you have the right interpretation, but I can see how they would take it as, oh, you need to treat me like God.
Oh yeah.
You're my slaves, you treat me like God.
They can bend it any way they're going to bend it. And they can justify themselves for being in church and praising the Lord and having just whipped that person that morning.
Yeah, I can see this as a huge ego boost for the
Yes.
slave owners. I don't think that's the right interpretation. I think you've got it
No,
right.
but that's how they abused it.
Yeah.
Were the slave owners Christians?
Were some slave owners, and you know, whether they were, we can't make a blanket statement every slave owner was a Christian, but were there some slave owners? Probably. Would they have treated people better? I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope they wouldn't have done
yeah.
what others did. But go further with me on this, verse 5 and following here. Ephesians 6, right? Okay, verse 6. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you. What would some employees have a tendency to do when their employer is around? Work hard, do a good job, right? But as slaves of Christ, is his eye ever away from you?
No.
No. All the time you are to do what with him? Serve him faithfully. Doing the will of God from your heart. Not just obeying, but obeying with joy from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly. That's his commandment to everybody. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people. So when you have a job to do, and in this slave relationship, you're apprenticing to be a carpenter, serve this man with all your strength and wholeheartedly, just as if that was Christ who's telling you how to cut that board and build that cabinet. Do it wholeheartedly. And because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Doesn't matter your financial and social position, it's your spiritual position. And then he says something to the masters, to the lords, to those that are the owners of the slaves. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not treat them, do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So those who own slaves and are going to teach them to be a carpenter or a doctor or a civil servant or whatever job they're under, you got to watch, as a Christian, you got to watch what you do too. The situation. Okay, Colossians 3. Trying to get through the New Testament references here so that you're not surprised by any. Colossians 3, verses 22 through chapter 4, verse 1. There's what's called family instructions, which usually involves slaves, wives, and children. Sorry, ladies, but that's how the family instructions were written many times in cultures. And they're usually together. If you look at Colossians 3:18, starts with wives, 19 husbands, 20 children, 21 fathers, and 22 slaves. There's instructions given to all the family units. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything and do it. Now, everything is always qualified. What qualifies everything? What's the context that qualifies everything?
As unto the Lord.
Everything that God approves. Everything that God commands. Everything never means everything. Just like in the Bible, all never means all. There's some exception someplace. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, right?
Yes.
All human beings other than Jesus. We got one exception there, Jesus. But so when you see a superlative like this, realize it has a context too, and it has definitive lines. Slaves, obey your masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you. What do we commonly do if you're working for somebody? Say I'm working on the farm and I'm weeding with a hoe. I'm going through the tomato, acres and acres of tomatoes up and down the rows, and I'm out there and it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon and that sun is so bright and the dirt is so hot and the heat's coming up from the dirt, and I'm just going to paint you a terrible situation. And there's no water around. The water is a long ways over in the other field, and you're out there with a hoe, and you would have a tendency to want to do what every once in a while?
Rest.
Just stop and lean against the hoe, you know. Like sometimes, like people that work on roads often do. You lean against the hoe, but if you see some dust flying down the road, and you know it's the boss's pickup truck, what are you going to be doing? Oh, get back to hoeing there. I'm working hard at weeding these things there. You know, that's typical of human nature, right? That's the kind of thing he's talking about. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. So it's God's eye is always on you. You do your work as unto the Lord, not unto man. That's the point. So whether anybody's around and sees it, doesn't matter, God does. Whether anybody's around and hears, doesn't matter, God does. So it's that attitude. Whatever you do, verse 23, whatever you do it with all your heart, as working for the Lord. So when you're under that slave relationship, whatever job you're doing, he says, I want you to work with all your heart as if you're working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you have received an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Maybe your master is not going to reward you very well. Maybe you're not going to, it's costing you a lot to apprentice with this guy. And it's going to be more years before you're set free. But it doesn't matter. Your reward is with the Lord. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. It's the Lord Christ that you're a slave of. It's him that you're serving. Anyone, it's the same word for serving, is the same word for slave. But it's the verb form of it. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Now, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair. Who are they supposed to copy as well? So, have a master in heaven. Jesus. And he's a good master. And the term slaves applied to us. And we're his slaves in that our person and our service belong completely to him. You okay with this so far? Coming along okay? All right, let's go to 1 Timothy 6. I don't want you to, when you come across the words slave and master in the New Testament, I don't want you to do a, ooh, why is that there? I don't want you to draw them back. I want you to see it in its proper context. 1 Timothy 6. Martha Stewart would say. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect. This word consider doesn't mean that they've earned it. It means that you give it. That you mentally do this because of obedience to the Lord. So that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Well, how's God's name attached to it? If you're a what? If you're a Christian and you've made known to people that you're a Christian, then everything that you say and do is going to be a reflection of your relationship to God through Christ. And so he's saying, anyone who where was I there? So that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. Just because your master is a believer and he's got to be kind to you doesn't mean you can get over on him and you can treat him harsh so that he treats you kindly. Mm-hmm. They have an unhealthy interest in controversies. I jumped down a whole paragraph. Instead, they should serve them with even because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves. So because your master is a believer, you should be even more attuned to wanting to be a blessing to them because they're fellow believers.
Pastor, that's great if it's a good master, but for the flip side of the coin, obviously, there were bad masters and, were demanding evil things of the slaves. And how would a believing slave respond to an evil master requesting or demanding evil?
Good point. We're going to get there.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm glad you see that already. I wasn't thinking about it. Now, let's go on to Titus chapter 2. Very next, after 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, comes Titus chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. It's actually going to be our 1 Peter passage. Yeah. Teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything. Now, when it says everything, it doesn't mean everything. It means everything that God says we may do, right? Okay, keep the context understood. to try to please them, not to talk back to them, and not to steal. Now, in some respects, you could apply this to your responsibility to your boss, though you're not a slave and he's your master. We don't have those kind of apprenticeships anymore, or relationships anymore, where you sell yourself out to somebody for a period of time. But you are responsible to do a job, and you have a job description, and you have a boss over you, and some bosses can be good, and some can be bad, and some can be downright terrible. So some of these things have a secondary application to that relationship, all right? Verse 10, and not to steal from them, but to show that they can be fully trusted, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God our Savior attractive. He has said this before. What's the goal in your relationship to a person who's over you? To make what? The teaching of God attractive. What it says there. To make the teaching of God attractive. Your life and your attitude and your relationship as a Christian should, for all people around you, be able to reflect the Lord and make the teaching of God attractive. How? By the joy of the Lord that's in your heart, and your faithfulness and your trust, and all these things that are good that He gives us to do, right?
That's good.
Yeah.
Is that similar to what employees do now? Like 3 months, they have to be like on probation until the 3 months is up, and
I don't know. I haven't worked in the workforce for years.
That happened to me. 3 months would be up the next day, and I got told to leave because they overbooked people to come into
Yeah.
this
Well,
organization.
they may do what they want to do.
Right, right. Well, that's what I was just
It's my
thinking.
attitude towards it has to be Christ-like.
I was shocked.
Well, anybody would be.
Yeah.
But the whole point is that Jesus wants us to serve Him 24/7
Right.
in all relationships. To your wife, to your spouse, to your children, to your church, to your employers, to your masters, and most of all, to Him. It's our new goal. It's what we're here for to do. There's a whole book in the Bible which talks about a slave running away and coming to a believer. I'm trying not to give it all away. And the believer finds this slave to come to Christ and is very helpful to him as a Christian slave, but realizes that he needs to send the slave back and prays that the owner will receive him with joy and not punish him because he ran away, and will be fruitful for him and realize how fruitful he can be. And if he's not interested, let him know, because he'd like him to be with him. What book did I just describe? Philemon. The book of Philemon. How many messages have you ever heard from Philemon? I'm going to ask myself, how many times have I preached on Philemon?
No,
I've never preached the book of Philemon. I've taught it and, looked at it, but I've never preached from it. But that whole book is about Paul asking Philemon's owner to receive him back, no longer just as a slave, but as a brother, because the owner is a Christian, and treat him as such, and hopefully to let him go, to free him. And if you don't want him as your servant, your slave, then send him to me, because he's of great help to me. And he was helping Paul in prison. So there's a whole New Testament book dealing with this relationship too. Now let's go to 1 Peter and start working a little bit on what I called you Nancy, Sandy. I don't know why. 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to begin with the context of verse 11, because I don't want you to take this out of its immediate context. And I want you to see the theme there about how we are to behave and treat others due to our relationships that we're in the world. Beginning in verse 11, I almost feel bad saying it when Cindy just left. But she's going back to get things ready. Well, it's time to have the discussion time. The last 5 minutes is, I'm going to save this for next week so that Sandy gets to hear it. Because she asked the question. All right? Let's save this for next week. Questions on what we discussed this week?
The slave owners in the plantation days, they didn't consider their slaves as on the same level as them, right? I mean, they thought
Again,
that-
I can't make a decree for every slave owner,
Yeah.
because I didn't know every slave owner.
Yeah,
But were there slave owners that may have done that? I've heard a few testimonies of that happening.
okay,
But that was not an institution in the South.
okay,
In the South, it was viewed as, number one, these are not full human.
yeah, that's what,
That was the first thing that was understood, is that the people that came from Africa were not on the same level as the people in America.
where did they get that idea from Satan?
Their sinful heart.
Okay,
And when you're allowed to purchase somebody as you would
yeah,
a new horse or
Yeah.
buggy, you have a tendency to give that the same kind of standing. It's an object.
okay,
Preachers in the South, the majority, not everyone, the majority in the South, and the writings that have come to us from those days, declare slavery to be biblical, and that these were people coming from the line of Canaan that were cursed, and their job on earth in this world is to be slaves.
okay,
That's what they were teaching. So if you were a landowner and you were going to a Christian church that taught that, which most did, not everyone, but most, you understood that the person that's up for sale at the auction is not equal to you or anybody like you, that they're lesser and they have been cursed by God as a race to do these kinds of jobs. Okay? Understand? That was what was behind the understanding of slavery in America. And all other places too, but it was in England and America that they tied the curse of Ham to this idea about people being cursed to this kind of a job. Not true. We covered that when we looked at racism and things. But they thought they were justified to treat, therefore, a person any way they wanted to treat them, just like they might their cow.
okay,
In fact, they whipped the slaves more severe and more frequently than they ever whipped the cattle. You can't beat a dairy cow, because what happens if you beat a dairy cow? Do you remember Alice? She won't give milk. She'll stop giving milk. What's the last thing you want to do to a dairy cow? Cut off your profits. They treated the cows better than the slaves. What did they do when they beat the slave? They thought they got more work out of them. They taught and treated people horrendously by, number one, making somebody who's made in the image of God to not have the same rights as every other person made in the image of God. There weren't many messages about being made in the image of God in the South in those days. Just didn't do it. These people were inferior. They weren't made in the image of God, they said. These are cursed people whose life exists to serve us. That was their understanding of this race. Now, is that biblical? Not at all. And that's why you can't take the concept of slavery in the modern era, meaning in England and America and other parts of Europe and even Africa, and apply to it the biblical understanding of slavery. You can't do that. It's not the same. It's not the same situation. Believe it or not, slaves in Africa were treated worse by Africans. They were tortured terribly, maimed, dismembered, emboweled while alive. They treated them, they burnt them. They did all kinds of things to them out of anger and mad. When they would capture another village and turn everybody in that village that lived into a slave, it was terrible, the stuff that they would do. The heart of man is deceitful and desperately wicked. And if you give a human being, unregenerate, a chance to be superior to another and treat others worse, they'll do it every time. The sad thing came when you had Christians who did the same. Now, there's testimony in history and I've read some of these in books, of Christian landowners who just would not do what their neighbors were doing, and they treated their slaves kindly. That doesn't mean they never smacked them upside the head or kick them in the butt. It just means they didn't whip them and they didn't treat them harshly or like animals. And the slaves that worked for them or were owned by them were so gracious, thankful for God giving them that master. They didn't want to break the relationship because they knew that if they broke that relationship, a bad one might come along and take them. And the good ones, the Christian ones, would never break up families. The ones that I heard testimony of would not break up families, whereas the ones without Christ would break up families very regularly because you got more work out of a person if you broke up the family.
But they still owned them.
But they still owned them. And we had people that led our government. Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. We had all these people that owned slaves.
Was it Thomas Jefferson that his slave was like husband and wife?
I don't know.
I know there was one of them
I don't know.
that wrote the Constitution.
Bruce?
To Darlene's original question, how prominent was this at the time? It was very prominent. Our U.S. Constitution, when you did a census, a free person counted as one whole person. A slave counted as 3/5 of a person.
3/5. Yep,
That's in the Constitution.
that was in the Constitution. Counted as 3/5 of a person. This was the common thought. Now, there was a small remnant of Christians in the North and in Europe who wrote against these things. Small remnants, meaning not many pastors. Not only did pastors in the South teach those things, but pastors in the North did as well. It's just that it wasn't common practice to own slaves in the North. But the attitude of the white person to a black person or of any other race was very, very horrible. And the attitude of many white people was what Bruce just said, because our government supported it and the Constitution declared it, that these are not real people. They're not full humans. You beat them, it doesn't hurt them as much as they were to beat you, would be the idea.
It's ridiculous.
It is absolutely ridiculous. But that was the attitude, and that wasn't addressed. And because of and now I get really big on this one, because of the economics of the situation, it wasn't going to be addressed. We're not going to stop profits. Profits come before people. Have you ever heard that before? Still happens today, doesn't it? Profits come before people?
The love of money.
Well, that's what Satan uses to make good people turn their heads the other way. Profits mean more than people. And that's true in companies today. Profits mean more than people. And it's a sinful desire of your heart. But as Christians, we need to be radically changed to have the mind of Christ. I don't know if you've noticed this theme, but for the last 5 years, I've been hammering on this in church and Sunday school for a long time. That we need to follow what Jesus says and thinks we need to do. Stop doing what you want to do. Listen to what God says. Become like Christ. And next week, when we get to 1 Peter 2, we talk about these things. I want Sandy to be here. We're going to see his answer to those questions. Of what do we do to those that treat us harshly? You're not going to be surprised. No. Well, thank you for your attention. Go enjoy.